Is it a simple realignment of a market that is over competitive now?
So many arguments within the private sector is do you actually have a moral obligation to society and humanity?
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another week of This Weekend Humanity. Rog, how you doing?
Good man, another good week.
We got a big one this week, and it's a nice one because it's from your background rather than from my technical background. So
Yeah,
this week, Meta announced in Australia that they're not going to be continuing their fund, which basically helps support local media. Now, just a little bit of background for anyone who might be watching and might not know the context. I think it was about 5 years ago. Would that be about right, Rog?
no, it was 2021. This is only
Was
like
it
this is a very
really?
recent thing. Yeah.
Right.
So
I
they
thought it was
so
before
basically
that.
they passed. Yeah, so it wasn't a private sector led thing. It was government legislation requiring social media companies to pay for the content that they use. Um,
Specifically related to the media.
exactly right, which is very interesting. I suppose that's the best way for them to attack it because there is that at least the illusion of the public interest, you know. So yeah, in 2021 they signed on a deal with the government and with the providers of news sphere related things, basically, because we have a very conglomeratized media industry. So it's easy to get those three guys in a room and say, hey, we'll give you some money for what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they've said this week that they're not going to renew that. I think a big part of it is because they brought in not long before that, they had their way to, um, I guess, push forward the news content more, I suppose, serious and like I said before, public interest information. They created a news tab along their
Yeah,
like
that's right.
suite of things that they had, which I haven't seen in a while. I definitely haven't seen that over the
Mm.
past couple of years. I remember seeing it very early on, and it was just one or two headlines, and
Yeah.
even
Well, you
then,
got to
they
go actually
didn't
look
seem that
for it.
newsworthy.
You
Well,
got to
exactly
press the
right. This
hamburger
is
to
the
even
other
see it.
thing. Yeah, which is fascinating, and I wonder because then from a product point of view, like if you have a product that is not easy to find, especially within a engagement based platform that Facebook is, I the way I experience, I'm not a big user of Facebook, but I definitely have been in the past, even in the past 2 to 3 years. Um,
Mm.
Especially during the pandemic, information seemed like it was for the first time in a long time. We really required. We felt like it was it immediately. Current information was so important for the public good. But the way I experience Facebook, and I think it's been set up to be like this at least over the past 5 years, is a constant stream of information where you have a few things that are from people that you know, depending on how big your network is, and then a few things from other streams, other companies, other channels, and then mixed in with some sponsored content, right? So using the tabs is not, um, especially like you say, you've got to go look for them. So I do wonder, from a product point of view, how serious they were about that. I know they've been winding it down over the past couple of years. I know they wound it down last year, or maybe even as early as 2022 in uh, I know France and Germany, a few European countries, in the UK, they've shut it down. I think the only place that it still exists is Australia and the US. And Australia, I think, is very
Mm.
specifically is return on investment is that they actually have to pay for it because there's very few places, a few countries have brought in legislation since then about that. I know Canada has very similar legislation that they brought in not long after we did, but uh, the statistics over the last year they say that 80 there's been an 80% um, decline in engagement with that news tab across America and Australia. I'm not sure of the individual statistics, but 80% down on anything terrible numbers, and
One
I'm
thing I
sure the
noticed that they
engagement.
didn't publish was whether there was an 80% reduction in news content. There was specifically 80% reduction
That's true.
in engagement with that
In
tab.
engagement, exactly right. Which is very interesting, and this is what happens when you have such behemoths that have all the information, right? And this is the power of those two or three um, tech companies is why the predicament has come along in the first place, right? Like especially advertising revenue, and I think of it as sort of there was two not missteps, but the news industry going from newspaper to online was the first thing, and so many uh, news. A lot of people don't, and I do make a distinction between news and journalism, and this is another thing that makes it so
Yeah.
easy to say, "Hey, so Meta doesn't care about journalism," and you're like, "Well, I think that's almost a given, but they are no longer as engaged. They're no longer as interested in news content because that slow march down from long form journalism to shorter form journalism to even making it very difficult to for journalism uh, at all in a effective way be able to exist and get to the right amount of people for it to affect the common good
Mm.
over the
Well,
past 10, 15 years
that's an interesting
has
thing about
been
journalism as
eroded.
well, is that it's not as a product. It's a bit like emergency services. The fundamental
It
thing
doesn't
that you're
make
trying
money.
to no, and it's not designed to deliver value in that way, but somehow it has
No,
to be
exactly.
financially sustainable.
Well, exactly. To be viable within a market arena within the private sector, that's the thing. If journalism, if it's a paradox, if it made money, your point is to report on power, and often that's where money is centered. And I know Noam Chomsky within his manufacturing consent is like, especially within um, the halls of power, if you report negatively on as a journalist who has access to sources within those halls of power, then very quickly you're shut out.
Of
So
course,
how
yeah.
is that an effective method of keeping tabs on power, which is what the Fifth Estate, that's what
Mm.
journalism originally was supposed to do. But it's very interesting that we've brought up that as capital, because that's what it is. It needs to function with it within that arena like any other private market has to, right? And Australia and because we have very strong, especially News Corp, which operates as Fox overseas. They're they're not just strong within our country, and this is what happens. I guess this is the globalized post like '80s sort of world, that they don't operate in distinct areas. They're across the whole world,
Mm.
right? And Australia is often a bit of a testing ground for legislation within that arena. Uh, but uh, they say they operate within the free market. That's always the um, uh, idea that's posited. But then they are legislating another company to say you need to pay us because you found a way around paying us for what we do, which is
Yeah.
like that's a very that's very intrinsically capitalist, right? That's like taking the excess from what someone else makes and finding a better market for it, or finding distribution channels for it.
Yeah. Yeah, of
um
course. And in
yeah,
a few seconds, I'd like to like play devil's advocate a little bit and kind of tease this out, because I
that's a
do
great
see that
idea.
there's a lot of like arguments back and forth, and personally, but not coming from a journalism background,
Yeah,
and in many ways coming from the exact opposite. I've spent my life in corporate environments or working with government, and so quite often, it's not that the media are seen as enemies, but they are by their very nature adversaries. And that's exactly what they're supposed to be in a
yeah,
healthy
well,
democracy. And
exactly. And
so,
even and competitors as well is another, I think, in a way, um is another way to frame that as well, because they, especially within it's such a crowded marketplace, the attention marketplace, especially over the last, it's now almost 15 years, right? Like
Yeah,
2009 was sort of the inception of most of those social media platforms. Then 2013 is sort of
yeah,
not critical mass, but like breaking into the mainstream. Like basically, when your parents are on Facebook, that's 2013, and that's when it
yeah,
became everything, and it really um, overtook those, even the non-traditional media outlets like BuzzFeed and that sort of thing. All of a sudden, those things that could go viral without Facebook, Facebook really took a
yeah. I met with
steering
the
hand in what you see.
yeah, I met with the CEO of Facebook in Australia in 2014, actually,
Mm,
and we're literally talking about, like, he was basically explaining their growth in the market, and also in particular their data offering at the time, and that was
yeah.
something a lot of people outside of the data industry, which obviously is my background,
Mm,
didn't really get a full vision on just how rapidly the data capability of what is now Meta, but was Facebook at the
yeah.
time, in that
Yeah.
3 to 4 year period from 2013, just not only were they getting exponential user growth, but they were getting exponential data capability, which has then led to this current trend of hyper personalization. But before
Exactly
we
right.
before we get on to that, one thing I did want to ask you is,
Yeah.
you've obviously still got a lot of contacts in the journalism industry. My question is, have you heard from any, like, of the people on the ground? What are people in the industry actually feeling right now?
Well, I think I haven't spoken to anyone about this. I think this only happened on Thursday or Friday, but
Of
I
course.
think 2021, the legislation and then the media bargaining with Meta, there was quite a bit of surprise, I think, because the leverage, I'm not super sure of the leverage, like how can you, it always felt like a very short term sort of thing. And I feel like that's what has happened with Facebook. They're like, all right, we'll sign this and then we'll walk it back once we have the correct framework, once we can say this,
Mm,
this, and this. And the conspiratorial mind in me thinks that you make a news tab, you bury the news tab, then you say that the content doesn't drive viewer engagement. It's not what people are after. And then the things that are of high enough engagement and
yeah,
end up in the stream anyway, right? Like, 'cause you still see all those things, and you'll see reporting from ABC or reporting from one of News Corp's arms or Crikey or something. It'll still come up in your mainstream if it's of strong enough
yeah,
impact. But yeah, the a lot of surprise from then, because it's all been going the other way. Like, to fight, even like
mhm,
uh, you see the inquiries and inquests and hearings in America to with Meta, and that, like, the power of the American, like, uh, uh, what's the word, legislative arm still is very powerless to get very much out of Meta.
yeah,
When, if they want to push back, then what leverage do you have over what is the most arguably the most powerful company of the 21st century,
yeah.
especially when you couple it with Alphabet. But between those two, if they push back on you, especially, usually the rest of
Look,
Silicon Valley will fall in
well,
behind them. Like, what
but
what do you
yeah.
have leverage over that?
Yeah, between those two companies, they make up, it's somewhere between 75% and 85% of all online revenue that is ever transacted in the world,
Yeah,
is those two
totally.
companies.
Well, this
So
is the
it's,
thing.
yeah, people
Yeah,
underestimate just how big they are.
exactly. And this came from advertising, and so much of the power of media, prior to the internet and even since then, is the ability to not only package content, well, it wasn't called content then, but package things together. But if you bought a newspaper, you weren't forced to read it all, but you would, because we're in a slower time. And once you'd read the couple of things you're interested in, you would at least scan the rest of it. Same
Yeah,
with magazines, same with television channels, even,
of
right?
course. Yeah,
It came as a package,
yeah.
and
Well,
then
that's where
that.
the concept of piggybacking content came from originally. Was there
100%,
weren't that many
and so
options,
much.
so you just want people to stick around.
Exactly right, and then and so much of that was your eyes were in the newspaper, so you sold your advertising space, which is exactly that's the same model until it became data driven. That was the same model that
Mm.
the internet had, right? Like you had pop-ups and you had banner ads and you had side things, and so many of like the homepage is almost dead, but all the mastheads for news still use that model. They're like, look, we have these people's eyes, we can get their attention on your whatever you have from here, here, and here, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
So let me.
uh,
I was just going to say, let me. So let's get started and do a little bit of back and forth here, and I'll play the
yeah,
devil's advocate. And I should clarify for anyone that's watching this. I don't have a really strong view on this entire saga, but I do see that
hmm
the integrity of journalism is integral to a
yeah,
to a functioning society. So, in that
yeah.
regard, anything
For
that maintains the
a healthy
healthiness.
society, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, definitely.
exactly. So, yeah. But I'm going to say three things, and then let's dig in and talk through them
Let's do it.
together.
Thing
So,
number one.
yeah, the first one, yeah, now I've got to remember exactly what they were. The first one is it is potentially a little bit hypocritical. So, I think it was $70 million a year that Meta were paying essentially into this fund.
Yeah.
Now, of that, a big chunk of it is being used by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, particularly to fund their regional offices. Now,
hmm
the ABC is a government-funded organisation, so there is
Yeah.
a very legitimate point. Although whether it's we agree with it or not, it is still a legitimate piece of logic to say, well, if Meta are paying their taxes, this is just another way to essentially tax cash out of them without changing the tax code in Australia. And
Yeah,
so to
totally.
fund services that the government themselves have a moral obligation to fund. The second point, which is quite very similar to the first point, but is about the other private organizations, the idea that a company like News Corp is not producing enough profit to be able to fund high quality journalism is absolutely unbelievable. What News Corp have invested in over the last 20 years is opinion-based journalism to try and trigger particular election outcomes in different jurisdictions around the world. And so again, if they found themselves in a situation where they require another private company to be funding them when they themselves have been making huge amounts of profit and wasting that profit, you think they had to pay $700 million to Dominion last year because of the nonsense that went on with Tucker Carlson. And so
Yeah.
you do have a little bit of a like, well, hang on a second. And then the third one is Facebook or Meta, I should say, sorry, as a company, outside of that news tab, have never purported to be a news company. They allow people to upload their own content. If journalists
Yeah.
decide they want to upload content, or news organizations decide they want to upload content onto that platform, why would another then private company who they've got no control over that, they're not deliberately taking, and this is one thing I do actually agree with, there is a very strong criticism from Meta that they have been then criticized for stealing other people's intellectual property. They have
Yeah.
never uploaded news content outside of that news tab. And
No,
so
it's not like Alphabet that then scrapes and then re-URLs and puts out things, because that is a
exactly,
very legitimate. That is legitimately say you are literally taking a product, copying it, and pouring the output into your coffers.
yeah,
That's not what
which
they've
is
done.
exactly. So let's pause there now. So there's the three. Government basically hiding a tax to
Yeah,
fund something.
exactly. Taxed by another name.
Exactly. You've got a private organizations crying poor when they themselves are returning extraordinary profits and appear to be
hmm
wasting that revenue. And then
Yeah,
third, the company who's being essentially penalized have never actually positioned themselves as this kind of organization. Now, again, I'm
yeah,
not saying that I agree with these things. I'm just saying that those are the
yeah.
very reasonable kind of
That's
arguments
what
that.
you see at the cause. Yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
100%. I was
And
going to
so
say working.
I was just
Yeah,
going to say,
working
you as
backwards.
a member of the media kind of community up until recently when you decided to move out of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
How would you respond to those three things?
My first thing is about so moving backwards. The third thing, saying they've never positioned themselves as media company, a journalism company, a news company. I think especially in the last 15 years, arguably the last 30 to 40, what journalism and news has changed because, like we say, it needs to operate within a private sector market. It operates within a market. That market used to be sort of just news, and we used to call it news and entertainment, and now there is no line between those two things. What is news, and having worked in newsrooms that need to put out a lot of content to the using a high content output model, there is the line between those two things is very blurred. You'll report on anything that you think will get engagement, and there's true fifth estate journalism beneath that, but you have to invest a lot of time and energy to get that. And it often is not as engaging, especially when it needs longer context, when it needs all these sorts of things. So the thing about not defining themselves because they don't define themselves as a publishing company, and this is one of the things over the last 5 years that they have really had to reckon with. Well, even the last 10, because especially in 2016, I guess, when there was a lot of talk about swaying and changing democracy, especially in America, just because it's so loud, because it's happened all across the globe, and it didn't really matter to anyone until it was happening in the center of the world. They self-definition, right? They're like, we don't define ourselves as a publishing company. But if you're publishing, then you get the difference between definition in theory and definition in practice, because the definition in practice is that you are the biggest publisher of media and information.
Yes. So this is where I don't know if I agree with you on that one. So for example, coming from I used to work in the music industry back in the day. And there's a lot of platforms you can use out there to pay to upload your content to, say, Spotify, for example. DistroKid is one of the really...
Exactly, 100%. CD Baby, all of them. There's 400 of them now,
Now, if a platform like that doesn't make any discretionary discrimination between high-quality content and low-quality content and lets everyone upload whatever they want, assuming it doesn't breach community standards, is that platform actually a publisher, or is it an enablement platform? That's one thing I've always never kind of set a hard view on with social media.
I think also
to clarify for anyone who might be watching this and may not understand why we've gone down this route, the mechanism with which the government can actually come back on this is to designate Meta as a publisher in Australia. And if they do, then they will be forced into legal arbitration with the media organizations to basically settle on a guaranteed annual financial amount. That never occurred in 2021 because Meta came to the table early and made an agreement, which is why they've been able to pull out of it.
Exactly, which is such a amazing move as well, because had that ruling gone and being able to slap them with that publisher role, then would have just incredible implications across the entire world. And it is interesting, right? Because that's the thing. I think lawyers on either side would be able to make better arguments than either you or I for the publishing thing. But the fact of the matter is that they are selling. It's like the old model of advertising, right? They're selling eyes for you. They're a distribution channel. And especially when you say between your search algorithm and your social media streams, that's 4/5 of the advertising in the world, right? And you can't operate like I said before, homepages are dead. Like, you don't go to a homepage of something. You're led there by somewhere else, and then maybe you favorite and you check back, but they're channels within platforms.
Yeah.
A couple of those other platforms are owned by Meta as well. So I think maybe, and it's interesting, I've just come to this now, that maybe the publishing thing, because that is old legislation as well. Like we need a better word since publisher, where especially if you're, because it's not the issue of whether they're publishing, whether they're a publisher or not, because that's just from a legislation point of view, right? Like that's just the word they use, but that's not the important function from either side that they perform. What it is curatorial and basically directly, indirectly, and algorithmically deciding what information people are shown, because it's no longer a matter of access. You can, and this is the thing about journalism, right? If you want to find out any piece of journalism that's out there, you can find it, but that's no longer the model of accessing information. It's a like fight to the top of the bucket to be the shiniest, brightest, most salacious thing.
This is a quite a legitimate question here. Does a platform like Meta have is that a moral imperative for them to be concerned?
Well, this is the other thing, right? Because we get down to this is the brass tacks of so many arguments within the private sector is, do you actually have a moral obligation to society and humanity? Like, is it really just the shareholders? Like, do you, because, and this is, like you said, emergency service is such a perfect thing, because they only exist, they exist outside of that private thing, and we'd like to think journalism does as well, but it never has. It can't operate outside of the private sector, and we like to think, especially with like I say, I draw a strong distinction between journalism and news, but what we use news to describe has for a long time been a very different thing, and especially in the modern age, the last 15 years, what you classify as news does not perform, and even cannot perform within a private sector, cannot perform for its moral, like the idealistic function that it's supposed to perform, because it's forced to fight within that same arena as much more engaging things,
And you've just triggered one final like devil's advocate point that I think would be really fun to explore, because it's triggered the economist in me, which is how do I articulate it? Is it, I think people particularly in the media industry love to blame the social media organizations for essentially, for lack of a better word, democratizing news. And so therefore, it's harder and harder to make money, because essentially people aren't paying for subscriptions, or they're not buying newspapers.
Exactly. Exactly. They brought down a lot of barriers for a lot of things. So like every person can be a publisher, right? Like that's the thing.
So if you look at the industry, I do wonder, and I think it's quite a legitimate wonder, is it the case that social media is to blame for this, or is it a simple realignment of a market that is over competitive now? So in economics, we have a concept called perfect competition, which is that, and it aligns to the intersection between supply and demand in your supply and demand curves. And essentially, a market that has too few competitors, if it is a free entry market, will naturally increase the number of competitors, which will reduce the price so it increases supply and therefore reduces cost.
Exactly.
If you have the other way around, you have way too many suppliers, that then essentially they will eventually go broke until the price naturally increases back up to a sustainable point. Now, I'm thinking about people like, Matt Taibbi in the US is a great example. Very, very popular journalist, very, very successful journalist. Almost his entire production is done through Substack, and there's 1,000 other examples of that same thing. My question is, are we just literally seeing that there's so many people around the world want to be journalists, want to be podcasters, want to be content producers, that we just have an oversupply? And instead of admitting that very particular, quite important dynamic, is it just the case that we're blaming social media companies because it's easier than admitting that not every man and his dog can be a journalist?
Well, I think that's very interesting because there is that level of, like I said before, of equating news to journalists. Like a journalist has sources, finds stories, gets original reporting, does all these sort of things. A lot of people who work in the news are not journalists. I would say most of them. I would say for the very most part, and especially in the last 10 years. But you do see things like 6 News that does very legitimate reporting. You see things like that. You see journalists on Substack. You see journalists on Medium that do get out real, genuine stories that, especially if you look for them, because they're hard to get to. But it's the amount of journalists has definitely increased. But what it means to work in the news and what it means to work as someone who wants their face on camera talking about things and to gain fame and money for that, whichever one, because they tend to go hand in hand within an entertainment industry paradigm. I think definitely there's an oversupply. There's an oversupply of people who want to be on camera, and they're sort of they are on the ground reporters, right? Like they were always the people. They want their face on camera. They want their face on camera, and some of them go on to be incredible journalists, but they're not. They don't perform it as an ideal, and so much of this comes down to me that journalism and as an ideal almost can't exist anymore. But I was going to say the other thing about the social media,
or the opposite may be true, that it can only exist as an ideal. So maybe it's a case of you can only 100%. Be the news can only be successful now if you're not doing it to try and make money. You're legitimately doing it because you believe that it's a public service and a public good.
100%. And there's so many, even within Australia, there's Michael West, there's Independent Australia, there's Pearls and Irritations, there's all these guys who are doing exactly that because they understand it as an ideal, but they don't make any money out of it. And then as soon as they try and do that, it doesn't work anymore. That's actually fascinating. It's philanthropy, right? And then also philanthropy, it's only accessible by a short, like a very small segment of the population. But just to go back to your question, I think social media is very easy to blame because it's a little bit like, to go back to your example of the music industry, right? Like the thing is, it's not that it's replaced anything that was there before. Streaming services, they haven't replaced a thing that was there before. Maybe access to distribution channels, but that wasn't a particular player. That was part of what a record company or label could do for you. What they are is they're now another level in the hierarchy that takes away the resources that allow you to perform that function that keeps it robust and closer to that ideal, I think. Because also it's impossible to operate successfully financially in a successful manner without going through those channels, right? We had one of the operations that I worked within in the second half of the last decade, 2016 and 19, basically between Trump and the pandemic, got its reach cut by Facebook, and basically we made half money that 6-week period. It's actually not tenable, right? Well, because this is the other thing, right? We have it's almost coercion. You're like, well, you upload all your stuff. We didn't force you to do that. but there is no other distribution model. Like no one's how many
Yeah.
subscribers, even fantastic journalists, even like the LA Times. I read like the Tribune, rather, New York Times has come out on top. It's very successful. It's reached
Yeah.
more people, I think, but even the numbers that it has, like the subscription model is it doesn't work. The paywall model doesn't work. The only
Yeah.
way to have a successful thing, even if that is to go through these new world behemoths, you know, and you can't operate outside of it. I think the real problem is, and we've lost from a legislative in the private sector, I think we've lost that ability to have check on monopolies, basically, because that's the thing. Facebook shouldn't have been able to buy Instagram. That's insane. That's
Mm.
insane. That's a personal judgment call, but the amount of reach that they have between them,
That
even
definitely
before that,
speaks.
was behemoth. You know, like it was
Yeah.
unheard of in the history. Who's had 4 billion customers in the history of the world?
Yeah, and it's very much speaks to the legislators and regulators who are overseeing this. You know, the risk of sounding ageist for many of them. It's a generational
Yeah.
thing. Like
Well,
it's
and
very difficult
this
if you
is
didn't
such a
grow up with these
problem
platforms to really understand
because
them.
what we've come to at the end, which is basically where we really should have started to begin with, is technology, right? It's an industrial
Yeah,
revolution, right? And the fact of the matter is, if you don't understand new technology, you can't regulate it. And the only people who are engaged in the technology at the forefront are obviously in the private sector. And why would you
yeah,
leave that when you're cutting edge to go and regulate that same thing and make enemies of every single one of your previous co-workers? It's
yeah,
just it's in like there's no even if you have one in 10,000 people do that, they're going to be swamped and crushed. It's never going to happen.
yeah,
It's not a realistic possibility. It's so regulation, and especially how long regulation, let alone legislation, takes to make robust enough to pass. And that's if you have partisan support for it. How is that?
yeah.
It's just not going to happen. So we continue on in these behemoths, and until the next thing comes along, they rule it. Like they they just run it. They run the world.
Well, on that very depressing note, Rog, we've come to the we've come to the end
It's
of our
only
time, but fascinating conversation.
it's absurd. It's absurd. It's you can let it depress you, or you can try and find the absurdity in it, and then try and work your way forwards. But amazing
Yeah,
conversation as always, Chris. Thanks for discussing
yeah.
your
Thank you,
humanity with
everyone.
me. See ya.
Have a great week, everyone.